Someone needs to get from their apartment to a job across town, a trip that would take 12 minutes by car. By bus, the same trip takes over an hour, requiring 2 transfers and a long walk on either end, even though a more direct route seems obviously possible looking at a map. The bus system isn't broken in any simple sense, and the planners who designed it weren't careless either. In a lot of cities, the actual bus network running today is substantially shaped by decisions made decades ago, based on where people lived and worked at a completely different point in the city's history, and changing that underlying structure turns out to be far harder than simply redrawing a few lines on a map. It's a strange thing to sit with on that hour-long bus ride, that the route beneath you isn't really a reflection of today's city at all, but a kind of fossil, still functioning, still carrying passengers, shaped by a version of the city that stopped existing generations ago. Public transit routes feel like they should reflect current, ongoing analysis of where people actually need to travel today, updated regularly as neighborhoods change and commuting patterns shift. And, to some degree, transit agencies genuinely do study ridership data and make adjustments. But according to research published by urban planning academics and transportation policy organizations, a substantial share of bus network structure in many established cities traces directly back to legacy infrastructure decisions. Original streetcar lines from the early 20th century, historical industrial employment centers that have since relocated or closed, and past housing patterns shaped by policies that concentrated development in specific corridors, meaning today's bus routes, often reflect where a city used to need transit far more than they reflect where today's actual travel demand sits. This distinction matters because it changes where the conversation about fixing transit should actually focus, less on whether planners understand the current mismatch, which research suggests they generally do, and more on the deep structural and financial reasons that mismatch persists year after year despite being well documented. Let's start with the basic mechanics of why transit networks are so resistant to redesign, because the underlying constraints go well beyond simple bureaucratic inertia. Many bus routes running today were originally streetcar or trolley lines built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, when private companies laid rail lines connecting new residential developments to downtown employment centers, often specifically to increase the value of real estate the same company owned along that route. When streetcars were phased out in favor of buses throughout the mid-20th century, transit agencies frequently preserved the existing route corridors rather than redesigning service from scratch, partly because those corridors already had established rider habits, existing street infrastructure, and critically because major capital investments like road widening, dedicated lanes, or new stop infrastructure require substantial funding and lengthy political approval processes that make wholesale redesign dramatically more expensive and slower than simply continuing to run buses along a route that already technically works, even if it no longer reflects where people actually need to go. This is where an invisible structural inertia takes over, one that most transit riders never see explained on any route map or schedule. Transit funding formulas at the state and federal level frequently allocate resources partly based on existing ridership levels on current routes, which creates a self-reinforcing cycle where established, heavily used legacy routes continue receiving funding priority specifically because they're already heavily used, while potential new routes serving genuinely underserved areas struggle to demonstrate the ridership numbers needed to justify funding, since those areas by definition don't yet have adequate service generating measurable ridership data in the first place. The technical process works like this. A transit agency evaluating where to add or restructure service looks partly at projected ridership. But projected ridership for an area currently lacking service is inherently harder to demonstrate persuasively than continued ridership on an existing route that already has decades of established rider habits built around it, creating a structural bias toward preserving legacy routes over building genuinely new ones matched to current demand. There's a related invisible mechanism tied to how residential and employment patterns have shifted since many of these route networks were originally designed. Mid-20th century zoning policies and post-war suburban development patterns pushed significant population growth toward lower-density areas built explicitly around car ownership, areas that historic streetcar-derived bus networks, designed around dense, centralized pre-automobile development patterns, were never built to efficiently serve it all. Meanwhile, many original downtown industrial and manufacturing employment centers that anchor points of legacy transit networks have declined or relocated over subsequent decades, replaced by newer employment centers, suburban office parks, distributed retail and logistics hubs, medical campuses, that frequently sit entirely outside the geographic footprint the original network was ever designed to reach, creating a persistent and widening mismatch between where legacy infrastructure physically runs and where contemporary travel demand actually concentrates. Two real-world patterns make this concrete. Multiple transit agencies that have undertaken comprehensive network redesigns, a process transportation planners sometimes call a frequent network, or ridership versus coverage restructuring, have documented significant ridership increases after deliberately reallocating service away from low ridership legacy routes toward higher frequency service on corridors matching actual current demand patterns, research published following these redesigns in cities that have undertaken them showing measurable increases in overall system ridership despite some individual legacy routes losing service entirely. A second pattern shows up in transit equity research specifically, where studies have found that transit-dependent populations, often lower-income residents without reliable access to a car, frequently live in newer, lower-density areas built after the era of legacy transit network design, meaning the population with the greatest practical need for reliable transit service disproportionately lives in areas the historic network structure was never designed to efficiently serve in the first place. This challenges the common assumption that a confusing, indirect bus route reflects poor current planning or a simple failure to study where people actually need to travel today. In reality, a meaningful share of transit network structure reflects a form of path dependency, where decisions made under completely different urban conditions decades, or even a century earlier continue shaping infrastructure investment today, not because current planners lack the data or the will to redesign service, but because redesigning entrenched infrastructure involves overcoming funding formulas, capital costs, and established rider habits that collectively make gradual, path-dependent evolution far easier than comprehensive redesign. The friction point isn't that transit planners are unaware of the mismatch. This exact problem is extensively documented and actively studied within the field. It's that fixing it requires overcoming structural momentum built up over many decades, a genuinely difficult undertaking that goes well beyond simply noticing the problem exists. Zoom out, and this same infrastructure built for one era persisting into a completely different one pattern shows up in other physical and institutional systems people navigate regularly. Highway systems in many countries were substantially shaped by mid-20th century national defense and interstate commerce priorities, routes and interchange locations that continue determining regional development patterns and property values today, long after the original strategic rationale shaping those specific routes has become largely irrelevant to how the roads actually get used. Electrical grid infrastructure similarly reflects power generation and population patterns from decades earlier, requiring enormously expensive and politically complex modernization efforts, specifically because the physical infrastructure, once built along a specific geographic pattern, resists redesign in ways that a purely theoretical, from-scratch redesign never would. What unites all of these systems isn't the specific type of infrastructure involved. It's the simple physical and financial fact that once something enormously expensive gets built in a specific place, the cost of moving or replacing it tends to exceed the cost of continuing to route new activity around whatever's already there, decade after decade, until the mismatch between old infrastructure and new need becomes large enough to finally justify the expense of changing it. So the next time a bus route seems to wind through an oddly indirect path that makes little sense given where people actually seem to need to go today, it's worth remembering what that route likely represents. It probably isn't evidence that nobody bothered to study the problem or that current planners are simply careless. It's more likely a visible remnant of infrastructure and funding decisions made under urban conditions that no longer exist, persisting forward not through neglect, but through the genuine structural difficulty of redesigning a system whose physical and financial momentum was largely locked in place long before anyone riding it today was ever part of the conversation.